So I went to the Demon Slayer world premiere last night at TCL Chinese Theater here in beautiful sunny Los Angeles to go be some of the first people in North America to see this movie, specifically in dub. And the event was incredible. I mean, yeah, I wore a velvet collared shirt and draped a sweater over my shoulders to cosplay Guillaume, so I was literally dripping in sweat when I met BB No Money and Iron Mouse for the first time, but so were they. Well, at least BB No Money was, because he was physically there. Iron Mouse was in their home. But anyways, after gallivanting across the red carpet and then being shooed off because Channing Tatum was walking through, I got to see Demon Slayer Infinity Castle a few days before it comes out nationwide, which is September 12th. And thus today, I want to do a review of the movie, both a spoiler-free and a spoiler-not-so-free review. With the spoiler-free review first and then the not-so-spoiler-free review after, so if you don't want spoilers, you don't have to watch them. All that is to say, I want to give you my pros and cons of this movie to help you better understand what to look forward to when it comes out September 12th. So with no further ado, let's get directly into Demon Slayer Infinity Castle is a masterpiece. But before we get to reviewing any movies, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video every single week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to the 1v1 fights. So, like I already said, we're gonna be opening up with a spoiler-free review. So in a spoiler-free way, I wanna run through the pros and cons of this movie. And trust me when I say, there's a lot more pros than there is cons. So for the moment, let's open up with our pros and go through the pros of the movie chronologically, which leads us to the first pro of the Demon Slayer Infinity Castle movie, which is that the first 10 minutes of this movie have an absolutely blistering pace. Last we left the Demon Slayers, they were cast down into the Infinity Castle after attempting to decapitate Muzan, and the movie does not hesitate in the slightest to pick up the action. On top of this, the artistic talent and directorial vision of this movie take no time going into full effect. There are a lot of times that watching this movie, especially on an IMAX screen, feels like riding a ride at an amusement park. You know, one of those ones where you sit in a chair and you look at a gigantic screen and your chair moves? That's kind of what watching this movie on a huge screen like they have at TCL Chinese theaters feels like. They use sweeping POVs to encapsulate just how vast and confusing the Infinity Castle feels to anybody inside of it, especially when individuals or entire groups of people are falling through the Infinity Castle. Now, I will say, as somebody who gets incredibly motion sick on those kind of screen rides, I call them, I caught myself going, whoa, once or twice, but I've never got motion sick, so don't be deterred. Now, if my chair had been moving, probably different story. But since we're talking about the vastness and the complexity of the Infinity Castle, think about every single time we've ever interacted with the Infinity Castle leading up to this movie. The CGI is usually incredible. It's dimly lit with paper sliding doors that make you feel as though you're in an old-style Japanese house that extends for miles and miles. It folds in upon itself, it shifts, it glides, it's daunting. Now, times that by 1,000. Anything that we've ever been shown of the Infinity Castle is shot up with steroids in this movie. The sheer scale of it is astounding. It is literally a technical marvel. If previously we explored a block of the Infinity Castle, in this movie, we explore a whole country. The scale is suffocating, and it's used as a way to separate the demon hunters from Muzan. And the level of CGI should genuinely be a case study for other anime. Some of the best I've ever seen, even in anime movies. But speaking of the Infinity Castle and how the camera has to operate within the confines of it, the way that we follow the Demon Slayers as they traverse through the Infinity Castle can only really actively be compared to a couple pieces of media. And the only possible comparisons I could think of was Spider-Man swinging through the streets of New York and Mahito in his battle against Mechamaru when he was shape-shifting into a bunch of different animals and we follow behind him. It's this flowy, ridiculous frame rate follow POV as the Demon Slayers have to crawl their way through this impossible to navigate landscape. But speaking of the Demon Slayers, every single one of the main Demon Slayers who gets dropped into the Infinity Castle gets their own moment to shine in the very first chunk of the movie. And that's really nice, not only to paint the picture of how separated everyone is, but also to remind you, the viewer, who's involved in the Infinity Castle arc. And that's kind of what the first 10 or 15 minutes of the movie are there to accomplish, to remind you who's been dropped into the Infinity Castle. However, when we do officially get to the more serious fights, they are absolutely gorgeous. See, I know some people aren't overly fond of how Demon Slayer has begun to incorporate CGI into some of the upper ranks techniques, like Gyoko's blood demon art fish or Hontengu's wooden dragon. However, the display of the upper ranks abilities in this movie, while they do largely occur in CGI, occur at a level of CGI that makes Gyoko and Hontengu's CGI abilities look like they're from the 1999 Berserk. See, I personally had no qualms with Hontengu's wood dragon or Gyoko's blood demon art fish. In fact, I thought the CGI pulled off with their abilities was some of the best I've ever seen in weekly releasing anime. I mean, I know Demon Slayer is seasonal, but you get it. And while technically Unfortunately, only one of the upper ranks whose fight is shown in this movie uses CGI. The CGI far surpasses anything we saw from Hontengu or Gyoko. And speaking of the fights, the fight choreo is turned to 11. Every single fight in this movie is elongated beyond what it was in the manga. This is a long movie with a runtime of 2 hours and 35 minutes. And while Demon Slayer's manga burn rate of manga chapters to episode is a relatively low for new gen 2.2 chapters per episode, this movie covers from chapter 140 of the manga to chapter 156 of the manga, which would tell us that if they went with the same pacing for all of the previous episodes of Demon Slayer for this movie, then the runtime of those 16 chapters would take about 2 hours and 25 minutes. If any additional time is tacked onto this movie, those 10 phantom minutes, it takes place in the fights. And I think this is done to accomplish exactly what the Hashira training arc being elongated was trying to accomplish, which is to show off the Hashira more, because every single Hashira in this movie is depicted as being incredible at what they're good at. Shinobu's speed is blistering. She's moving like a prime Minato. Kiyome's strength is overwhelming, and Iguro Obadai is shown as a slithering menace that's able to cut down demons from any angle. So the fights are incredible, and the Hashira truly shine. But did their voice actors? See, like I said, I saw the movie in dub. Now, I usually watch the show in sub. I've seen the show in dub. I don't dislike the dub. I love Bryce Papenbrook as Inosuke. I love Alex Lee as Zenitsu, and plenty of the castings in English are as close to perfect as you're gonna get. However, if I had to give a gold star to anybody in this movie, it would be Alejandro Saab and Alex Lee, who genuinely have an aura farming off for like 10 minutes in this movie. They're two of the best English voice actors that we have, and them being head-to-head in this movie makes for incredible dub acting. On top of this, apparently because Channing Tatum's daughter is a huge fan of Demon Slayer, Channing Tatum got a somewhat minor role in this movie, and he does a pretty good job at voice acting. Like, I wouldn't say it's anything special, and you can definitely hear that it is Channing Tatum, but it's also not distracting. It's not like Chris Pratt's Mario. I could see him doing more work in anime, but he's definitely no Robert Pattinson. But speaking of all the aspects that went into the sound design of this movie deserves to be heard in either a theater or a house with surround sound. Whether it's the crackling of lightning breathing or the thunderous impacts of Guillaume's stone breathing, you want to watch this movie with a sound design that allows for you to feel it in your chest. Watching it just on TV would be robbing yourself of a lot of the experience. And speaking of being robbed of the experience, make sure you go into this movie willing to laugh. It is a deeply, deeply serious 2.5 hour movie. However, the Demon Slayer humor does deliver at key moments. Now, that humor is just everyone's eyes getting little and them turning into chibi versions of themselves. I mean, there is literally visual cues as to when you're supposed to laugh, but that's Demon Slayer humor. It's not transcendent, but it is fun. But speaking of things that you should also probably do before you head into this movie, I'd refamiliarize yourself with all of the Hashira. Maybe look up their names, what kind of breathing they use, who likes who showed up in what arc, and therefore if you pop over to Guillaume and you don't remember who Guillaume is, you're gonna be like, okay, why are we spending so much time with this guy? However, this somewhat constantly shifting perspective, showing us what individual groups are doing at certain times, does a really good job of establishing the scale of the Infinity Castle and how separated everyone is. However, with all that said, I would say the movie truly shines when it decides to just focus on one fight, because while shifting perspective does materialize the scale, if I'm being entirely real, while the fights are technical marvels and absolutely beautiful to behold, the backstories and the slow moments actually steal this movie. And while Demon Slayer has always delivered with these slow moments, like conversations and backstories, I would say that the pacing of the slow moments in this movie is actually the best we've ever seen in Demon Slayer. Now, with that said, that's all of the pros I have for the non-spoiler review. Let's get to the cons. First up with the cons, if I'm being real, the dub is just not as good as the sub. Like I said, a lot of people deliver incredible performances, and nobody delivers a bad performance. And I am not a dub or sub supremacist. I watch what's ever better, and usually, for being honest, I watch dub because I'm usually doing stuff while I'm watching anime. However, if you're gonna see this movie in a theater where you're not gonna be scrolling your phone and you're gonna be locked in the entire time, I would recommend sub. Like I said in the pros section, some people in the dub cast give transcendent performances, like Alex Lee as Zenitsu and Alejandro Saab as Kaigaku. However, unfortunately, some of the main voice cast, like Tanjiro and Shinobu, at least to me, fall a little flat. Now, outside of that, while the fights are incredible and there's very few bad things to say about them, all of them are extended. And while an extended fight means more fight and more choreo to sit there and marvel at, it also means additional dialogue. And when we step away to do backstories in between the fighting, it means the backstories are elongated. And because of this introduction of additional dialogue and additional backstory length, it kind of breaks up the momentum of what used to be, at least in the manga, relatively quick fights. Tie this into the fact that while the sound design of the movie is absolutely peak, unfortunately, the musical direction didn't agree with me at every moment. Don't get it twisted, there are some ridiculously hype moments in this movie. However, I do believe that they could have been hyper with better music choices. And that was really surprising to me, considering how good Demon Slayer's music has always been. Now, I'm not saying the music is bad, but it is a little bit worse than previous Demon Slayer episodes or movies. And music design isn't necessarily the only thing that takes a relatively small step back comparatively to the rest of Demon Slayer in this movie. See, Demon Slayer is usually focused on a small group of people, whether that's Zenitsu, Inosuke, Tanjiro, and Rengoku in the Mugen Train, the main four and Tengen in the Entertainment District arc, Tanjiro, Moishiro, and Matsuri in the Swordsmith Village arc, and so on and so forth. Demon Slayer usually focuses on 4 or 5 people simultaneous. Therefore, if there is a fight going on, you're probably not going to shift away from that fight because that fight's all that's happening right now. However, that's not the case in this arc. At any given moment in this movie, there are 7 or 8 fights happening. And while constantly popping over to all of those fights introduces a level of urgency in scale not yet seen in Demon Slayer, it can kind of rob individual fights of their momentum. Because just as we're getting into one fight, we have to pop over to another Hashira to see what they're doing. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is new for Demon Slayer. And the last out of my spoiler-free cons is that this movie is long. It is 2 hours and 35 minutes long. And therefore, if you struggle with watching long movies in theaters, maybe wait until this movie hits Crunchyroll. We did our red carpet at like 5 p.m. We were shooed off the red carpet by like 5:45 p.m. The movie didn't start until like 7:20. I, like an idiot, was like, oh, well, if we're done with our red carpet, then we must be done with everyone's red carpet, and peed right then and went to sit down, and nope. There was still like an hour and a half till the movie was going to start. I was about to burst the entire movie, but I didn't want to leave because I didn't want to miss anything. So either make sure you pee before you sit down, or like I said, watch it at home. And with that, that's all of my spoiler-free pros and cons. I'm now going to get into my spoiler not-so-free review. So if you do not want spoilers for the Demon Slayer Infinity Castle arc movie that comes out September 12th, this is the part of my video where you go somewhere else. Goodbye, I love you. I'm going to start with spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because I know currently some of you aren't at your phone and you're sprinting back to it to pause the video right now. I'm not really going to be breaking my spoiler review into pros and cons because I don't have a ton of cons as it relates to the spoiler version of this review. So I'm just going to go through the movie chronologically and tell you what I thought about it with details included. In the spoiler-free review part of this video, I told you about how the CGI of one of the upper rank's abilities is gorgeous, and that upper rank is Doma. While we don't get a ton of Doma's cryokinesis, when Doma ever does pull out his cryokinesis and creates lotus flowers out of ice, it is gorgeous. Now, we don't get any of Doma versus Kanao, and for those of you who have read the manga, you'll know that we get the highest level of Doma's cryokinesis when he battles against Kanao, after absorbing Shinobu. So it was kind of just like a teaser for what his gigantic ice Buddha is gonna look like. On top of this, while we're talking about Doma, his voice actor absolutely kills it. Doma was obviously a child born into a cult, and because his parents were the leader of that cult and Doma was born with white hair and rainbow eyes, they instilled him as the leader of their cult. And thus Doma is kind of stuck with the mentality of a child and also thinks about people as substantially lesser than him. And Doma's English voice actor does an incredible job displaying the childlike exuberance of Doma, even when saying deeply morbid stuff. Now, once again, for those of you who have read the manga, you'll know that Shinobu's battle against Doma only lasts 2 chapters. It starts in chapter 140-ish, I believe, and it's already over by chapter 142. However, kind of like how Hinata was shown to throw more punches at the Devapath in the Pain arc in Naruto, which made it seem as though the Devapath was more pressed by Hinata in the anime than he actually was in the manga, Shinobu was shown moving like prime Minato in this fight, in the movie. Like she has a substantially better chance against Doma than she's ever given in the manga, because while in the manga, she does stab Doma a couple of times, and they talk about how he's able to negate her poison. In the manga, the sentiment is truly that Shinobu's only purpose in this entire fight was to be absorbed by Doma. However, this fight is a good 10 to 15 minutes long in the movie, and there is a lot of added choreography and backstory information for both Doma and Shinobu that really heightens this bloody rivalry between the two of them. Personally, I think it's a way better depiction than the manga did, but the added backstory length does kind of rob a little bit of the momentum from this fight, and therefore, this fight between Doma and Shinobu is probably the worst fight in the movie, but that's a very, very, very high bar. I would still say that this fight is probably better than everything we got from Gyoko or Hontengu. But since we're talking about voice actors absolutely crushing it in this role, while I don't love Shinobu's performance in the dub, the reveal of Shinobu's death to Kanao is chilling. Her voice actress absolutely crushes it, leading to it becoming one of the weightier moments in Demon Slayer. Now, the next main fight that we're shown in this movie is Kaigaku versus Zenitsu. Now, this is where Alejandro Sub and Alex Lee go head to head. And honestly, this is probably the only part of the dub that's worth watching over the sub. Like, if you're watching the sub, I'd actually recommend switching to the dub just for like this second half hour of the movie, because that's kind of how the movie breaks down, by the way. It's like the first half hour is dedicated to everybody falling into the Infinity Castle. We then get Shinobu versus Doma, and then we get like almost a half hour of Kaigaku versus Zenitsu. And once again, for those of you who have read the manga, you'll know that Kaigaku versus Zenitsu is only a 2-chapter fight. This fight is also massively elongated, or at least it feels that way. There's additional exposition given to Kaigaku and Zenitsu's relationship when they were both training under the former Lightning Hashira, and while they hit all of the same story beats in both the backstories and the fights, a lot of choreo and dialogue to make the moment feel more important, because we haven't seen Kaigaku in like 50 episodes, is added to make you feel for Zenitsu trying to avenge his master who committed seppuku because he was so ashamed of Kaigaku becoming a demon. And like I've already said a million times, Alex Lee crushes Zenitsu. I don't really think there's a role he hasn't crushed recently, but like this is some of his best work. And while the sound design of every time Zenitsu uses Thunderclap and Flash is incredible, I think this is the first time I've ever seen it in an IMAX theater. And oh my god, the lightning crackling off Kaigaku's blade and Zenitsu's aura, and the explosions that happen every single time Zenitsu plants one of his feet is awesome. Now, obviously, this fight ends in the exact way that it ends in the manga, with Zenitsu using a Thunderclap and Flash while falling down the Infinity Castle to decapitate Kaigaku. And that is one of the hyper moments in the movie. However, it was actually in this scene where I got my gripes for the music. Something about the music choices during Kaigaku's beheading, it's just like too plucky. I don't know, I just didn't like it. But it's still a really cool moment. But everything in this movie honestly pales in comparison to the last hour and a half. See, like I said earlier, the first half hour of the movie is dedicated to Doma versus Shinobu. The second half hour of the movie is dedicated to Zenitsu versus Kaigaku. And while the fights themselves and the backstories aren't a full half hour, you're popping over to the other Hashira and the other kind of no-names like Murata. That's kind of how the first hour breaks down. However, the last hour and a half is all Giyu, Tanjiro, and Dekaza all the time. And it is by far the best fight in the movie. It is, in fact, by far and away the best fight in the story yet. And with all that being said, it also very easily could have been its own movie. I'm not kidding when I'm telling you that from the introduction of Akaza to Tanjiro and Giyu to Akaza's death is probably about an hour and a half to an hour and 40 minutes. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh, well, they probably dragged it out. No, they smashed it. Not only is the battle between Tanjiro, Giyu, and Akaza better than some of the other best fights in Demon Slayer like Tengen versus Gyotaro or Rengoku versus Akaza, Akaza's backstory is the best written and best executed backstory we've ever seen in Demon Slayer. And it is long, north of a half hour by itself, and in a movie that features Shinobu's death. Everybody I talked to while leaving the theater agreed that Akaza's backstory held way more weight than Shinobu's death, or even Kaigaku and Zenitsu's battle. The backstory and the way that it's portrayed in this movie is a masterclass in storytelling and does an incredible job at portraying the tragic story that is Akaza's. And as somebody who A, didn't know how long this movie was going to be, and therefore B, was very much surprised that they included all of Akaza's fight, seeing that whole, almost, I believe, 13-chapter battle play out on the silver screen was awesome. So overall, what would I rate Demon Slayer Infinity Castle? A solid 9.2 out of 10. And honestly, that might be a little low just because I had to pee the whole time. But with all that being said, if you guys have the opportunity to see this movie in theaters, September 12th, please do so. It's awesome. And if you do go see it, let me know if you agree with my takes on the movie in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm sick for the second time in 2 weeks, and I'm gonna go lay down.